In the spirit of Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Hermann Goering, the United States of America was both admired and despised as a rival, expanding empire. In one way or another, the Nazi leaders viewed the United States as a mixture of industrial power and cultural decay that they were never able to fully grasp, let alone foresee in the course of World War II. Since 1940, Hitler viewed America as a bastardized nation, racially inferior, poisoned by democracy and immigration. Yet this hybrid being was nevertheless recognized and respected for its vast resources and potential for influence. Himmler, who had a problem with the question of miscegenation, saw in the United States an example of a nation that mixed races. Goering, on the other hand, accepted the strength and socio-economic progress of the Americans, but disapproved of their political system. Attitudes changed in the early stages of the conflict before America entered the war. Having previously regarded American power as insignificant, the Germans entered a phase of resigned acceptance. Eventually, they reluctantly realized that America would emerge as the final force that would crush the Third Reich. But to what extent did these perceptions influence the Nazi approach to war? And did the Reich really ignore the nation it would ultimately defeat? The first perceptions: the National Socialist ideology before the war and the changing attitudes of America. During his rise in the 1920s and 1930s, Adolf Hitler developed a strangely ambivalent attitude toward America, based on racial and political considerations. This is evident in his book Mein Kampf, published in 1925. Hitler was firmly convinced that the Aryan race was the pinnacle of human evolution. Hitler believed that the strength of a state rests on racial foundations. According to him, this principle has contributed significantly to the development of Germany in history. On the other hand, Hitler recognized America's power. However, he considered it a decadent country with a hybrid population and democratic institutions. This can probably be explained by the fact that Hitler saw American democracy as the exact opposite of the authoritarian state he so much aspired to. When Hitler despised a nation or political system in Mein Kampf, he was most vocal in his portrayal of Americans and their government, which he saw as a confused and weak system that he believed administered a culturally inferior population. He viewed democracy as an imperfect system that gave power to the citizens and thus prevented the central power that, according to Mussolini, served the interests of the nation. For Hitler, then, the United States was a nation of half-breeds, a racially inferior nation that had given up all hope of creating a superior race. Another criticism of the USA by Hitler concerned the uncontrolled diversity, which he saw as harmful to racial purity. Hitler saw the immigration of various ethnic groups to the United States, especially those he considered inferior, such as Jews and African Americans, as evidence of America's racial decay. Hitler deplored the mixing of races promoted in the USA by the melting pot policy, which he saw as an effective destroyer of American society, and presented his views on this in Mein Kampf. For him, the fundamentals of American life were diametrically opposed to his vision of the Third Reich, which was based on strict racial selection and eugenic values. Although Hitler respected America's industrial and economic power, he gave it less importance, seeing it as cyclical. He was convinced that America's great achievements in industry and technology were doomed to failure without a pure Aryan race. This racist attitude led Hitler to underestimate the ability of the United States to become a world power. For him, American civilization had degenerated, with no ideology and race capable of challenging a resurgent and racially cleansed Germany. While he despised the democracy and racial diversity of the United States, Hitler saw in them a negative example of what happens to a nation that does not care about its race. This formed a large part of the early racial, immigration, and eugenics policies of the Nazi regime. In pre-war propaganda, the NSDAP used images of America to show Germans the kind of world that the Aryan race had to avoid. The Racial Theories of Himmler and America, a historical investigation of influence and impact. As head of the Schutzstaffel, the SS, and head of the Nazi regime's racial and settlement policy, Heinrich Himmler had a firmly racist worldview. For Himmler, the world was divided between races and degenerate nations. This world was in a war that would decide the fate of humanity. To him, America was a warning and a threat, a country where mixing and immigration had produced what he saw as a primitive population. Himmler's concern about America stemmed mainly from his fear of racial contamination. A passionate advocate of the racial policies of the Third Reich, especially the Nuremberg race laws of 1935, he propagated the superiority of the Aryan race and regarded the mixed population as a factor of social degeneration for Germany and the world. In his view, America was the perfect example of what threatened any society that had not learned to eliminate what he called the leprosy of miscegenation. The American population consisted of Europeans, Africans, Asians, and Native Americans, all living in a democratic society that Himmler described as racially and socially mixed. Himmler wrote and spoke of his fears in the face of what he believed to be the growing threat posed by the Americanization of the world. He regarded the multicultural policy of the USA as a direct challenge to national socialist racial policy. The United States promoted freedom and equality, principles alien to the Nazi regime, which sought to establish the Aryan race as superior to others. These American values threatened Himmler, as they could destroy the National Socialist goal of a pure and superior Aryan race. Culturally, Himmler was concerned that a racial and cultural America could influence the rest of the world. Hollywood films, music, and other cultural products were seen as carriers of undesirable ideas that promoted racial integration, democracy, and liberalism. For Himmler, America was merely a political and military power that stood in the way of the realization of a Germanic Aryan civilization, a culture that weakened Germanism and especially Aryanism. Himmler dreamed of pushing back America's influence on the rest of the world and propagated strict isolationism at the international level. He knew that the United States could threaten the regime's international power if it allied itself with the USSR or Britain. He feared that America's greatness and growing strength as a democracy could mobilize the entire world against the will of the Nazi regime to exterminate the inferior races. Himmler saw in the USA not only a racially degenerated state, but also a powerful enemy that could prevent the expansion of the new order led by the Aryan race. Hermann Goering's pragmatic views on American influence and German power. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Goering, one of Adolf Hitler's closest confidants and head of the German Air Force, had a more realistic view of America than the sharp anti-American sentiments of Hitler and Himmler. As head of the Luftwaffe and the Four-Year Plan, Goering was personally and professionally interested in Germany's war and economic potential. His attitude toward the United States was far less racist and more pragmatic, recognizing the industrial and technological strength of the United States. Goering respected America's industrial power while despising its political structure, which he saw as too cumbersome and dangerously democratic. While Hitler apparently ignored America's productive power, Goering was aware of its strength as Germany prepared for war. He valued the natural resources, manufacturing industry, and technology of the United States. Many considered America to be an industrial superpower, capable of producing war material on a scale that could hardly be matched by any other nation, not even Nazi Germany, which Goering recognized. He claimed that American industry, supported by a dynamic capitalist structure, could surpass Germany, especially in the later phases of the war, as was eventually confirmed. In the interwar period, Goering was interested in aviation technology, American automobiles, and military equipment. He respected the innovations of American companies such as Ford and General Motors, as well as their assembly line and mass production techniques. Goering was known to admire the Ford Company, and its founder, Henry Ford, was in many ways in line with the values of Nazi ideology, as he was a successful businessman and notoriously anti-Semitic. Although Goering admired America's industrial prowess, he despised its political system. He considered American democracy to be a flawed and chaotic system in which leadership would have to come from a single source of power. For Goering, the basic problem of democracy was the concentration of power in the majority, which led to instability and uncertainty in decisions. He saw frequent elections, freedom of speech, and the emphasis on individual freedom as shortcomings that condemned America to internal decline. For Goering, the basic principles of American democracy, based on equality and freedom, were at odds with his ideas of an authoritarian state run by a strong authority and enforcing the nation's values. He viewed the American political system as ineffective, especially in times of war, when quick decisions and bureaucratic control were required. Goering thought that American industry would supply weapons, but the political system would prevent their efficient use. Guided by pragmatism, Goering understood that America could be a powerful rival, but only if it focused on its productive potential. He cautiously acknowledged the country's potential for development and production. Nevertheless, he believed that the United States was too entangled in its democracy to become a dangerous adversary in the first phases of the war. This miscalculation, which was also shared by other leaders of the Third Reich, was one of the reasons for the initial attitude towards America in 1945 World War II. Goering reconsidered his views as the war progressed, especially as America became increasingly involved in industrial and military activities. He realized that American industry, supported by the full cooperation of the Americans, could ruin the Axis powers. Nevertheless, he began with respect for American wealth while despising democracy, an attitude that was also shared by the rest of the Nazis and which led them to a fatal mistake. The Second World War and the National Socialist perceptions of the role of America. When the United States entered the war in December in 1941, the Nazi leadership was both surprised by the magnitude of the American involvement and concerned about the ability of the Americans to quickly translate that commitment into military successes on the continent. Until then, the leaders of the Third Reich, including Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Hermann Goering, had viewed America as an unfit power incapable of waging a large-scale war. Before the war, the German Nazis saw the United States as a mixed-race and politically divided society capable of supplying raw materials for the German war machine but not fighting. At first, Hitler doubted the ability of the United States to endure a long war. He believed that the social vices of democracy, racial diversity, and materialism were undermining American society and preventing it from preparing for World War. This conviction was based on his assessment that the US had neither the will nor the solidarity to make a difference. But this illusion was shattered when America entered the war after the Axis attack on Pearl Harbor. An uninvolved country became an efficient war machine that mobilized its economy and society and took the Nazis completely by surprise. The rapid growth of the American military-industrial complex seriously alarmed the Nazi leaders. The American war machine produced tanks, planes, and ships on a scale that the Axis powers could never match. As early as 1942, it became clear that America's economic power was not just a theoretical concept, but a real tool for the war effort. American industrial and technological capabilities exceeded the expectations of the Nazis. Factories that had previously produced for the domestic market now produced war equipment on a scale that was not equal to that of Germany. Initially, the Nazi leadership was surprised that America was able to achieve success so quickly in World War II. Operation Torch in North Africa, led by the Americans, was the beginning of a series of successes, most notably the advance into Normandy in 1944. This destroyed America's image as a weak link in global power and refuted the Nazis' illusions of a diplomatic victory over America. After all, Himmler and Goering saw America as a country of industrialists and a great military power. Ultimately, the United States became the victors on the world stage and played a crucial role in Germany's defeat by exposing its tactical mistakes. The changing perception of Hitler, the USA as a superpower, and the strategic miscalculations of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler's perception of the United States evolved over time, especially during World War II. In the early 1930s, Hitler viewed America as a racially mixed and politically unstable country. His attitude changed after the war began in the face of the brutal realities that the war brought with it. In the final years of the conflict, he began to see the United States as one of the new superpowers. As Germany began to lose the war, Hitler added to his long-term strategic vision the idea of a future conflict with the Soviet Union that would determine the fate of the world. In the 1930s, when he was seeking power, Hitler did not take America seriously and did not consider it a major world power. In Mein Kampf, he described the USA as a half-breed nation, without cohesion and weakened by miscegenation and democracy. He claimed that racial diversity and lack of equality limited this nation's ability to achieve greatness. Hitler believed that American society was incapable of waging protracted wars or exerting significant military or political influence. For him, Germany had to be racially cleansed at the same time, and he was convinced that the Third Reich, based on the superiority of the Aryan race and authoritarianism, would control Europe and then the whole world. Although Hitler despised America as a country of degenerate culture, he could not completely ignore the country's global economic importance and was aware of the industrial potential of the United States, supported by immense natural resources and advanced technology. However, he assumed that political division and the desire for material abundance would prevent the US from developing the force necessary for an international war. He underestimated the ability of Americans to mobilize their economy for war production and rejected the idea that America could interfere in European affairs. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December in the year 1941 and the subsequent entry of the Americans into the war fundamentally changed Hitler's perception of the United States. What had previously been seen as a near-alien and distant power developed into an immediate threat. Surprisingly, Hitler declared war on the US shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, believing that this would maintain the alliance between Germany and Japan and end the war in Europe in a month. But as the conflict progressed, Hitler increasingly lost confidence in his ability to contain American power. As early as 1942, Hitler realized that America had real industrial and military power. The US industrialized war economy, supported by a massive production capacity, produced and supplied the Allies with tanks, aircraft, ships, and other vital resources for the war. The Allies were unable to sustain a large-scale war for long, primarily due to their inability to match American production. To Hitler's great surprise, he found that the United States, which he had despised as a weak and racially polluted nation in the early 1940s, could shift the balance of war. Hitler's perception of American military power only changed when the attacks on Europe began, especially with Operation Torch and Overlord, which entailed the actual American presence in Europe. The US was transformed from an industrialized economy to a militarized one, determined to win decisive victories. Realizing that America and the USSR would become the two future world powers in the year 1944, Hitler envisioned a future conflict between the two as a way to rebuild Germany after defeat. Even though he recognized American power, he continued to hold to the belief of the racial superiority of Aryans and believed that diversity would gradually demoralize Americans. Ultimately, these changes revealed the strategic errors that led to the fall of the Third Reich. The role of American culture and propaganda, the tool for world domination. As could be observed during the Second World War, aggression and propaganda played a decisive role in the success of the Nazi regime. As the war progressed, German leaders became increasingly concerned about the threat of post-war Americanism that might challenge their own propaganda. In response, the Nazis launched an intense propaganda campaign that questioned the morality of American values, mocked American popular culture, and portrayed the United States as a nation with reprehensible intentions. Shaping and manipulating the image of a country at war and under occupation, as well as combating enemy propaganda, were the main means of controlling the minds of the people in Germany and throughout occupied Europe. As early as the 1930s, when Germany was preparing militarily for the conflict, the National Socialists had built up one of the most sophisticated propaganda industries of the 20th century, under the leadership of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. Early on, the focus was on propaganda and information control. Goebbels understood that this was just as important as military victories. The popularization of Nazi principles among the masses, especially with regard to race, democracy, and their alleged degeneration, was a central part of this plan. But as the war intensified and American culture spread, the Nazis were faced with an unexpected challenge: the globalization of American pop culture, entertainment, music, and film. Hollywood, in particular, was considered particularly reprehensible by the National Socialists. Even in Nazi-dominated Europe, American films were in demand because they showed glamorous aspects of life, freedom, and individualism. Cinema was appreciated by Goebbels, who was fully aware of the power of this medium and did everything he could to keep American films away from Germany. He regarded them as transmitters of pernicious ideas such as liberalism, racial degeneration, and democracy, which contradicted National Socialist ideals. Through entertainment, American culture thus exported a message of freedom, diversity, and egalitarianism, ideas that were threatening the bureaucratic and discriminatory principles of the Third Reich. In response to these challenges, Goebbels launched countermeasures of propaganda. The Nazis began to produce their own films, news, and radio broadcasts that were intended to delegitimize American culture. These productions portrayed the US as a morally corrupted country marked by segregated racism, where the supremacy of Jews, blacks, and other non-Aryans, considered subhuman by the Nazis, was encouraged. The message was clear: the American dream was a myth, and American pop culture was just an elaborate strategy to spread corruption. One of the most vicious works of anti-American propaganda of the Nazi regime was the film The Eternal Jew, which was produced in 1940. This film portrayed Jews dominating Americans, influencing film production and the global media, and spreading immoral and anti-traditional values throughout society. This was part of a broader Nazi propaganda campaign that portrayed the US as an agent of a worldwide Jewish oligarchy engaged in a global conspiracy against the German people, as Hitler had described it in Mein Kampf. Goebbels understood that radio could inform millions of people across borders, and the German-controlled stations broadcast messages to discredit US involvement in the war. The statements were deliberately designed to stir up race and race-based divisions. Japanese propaganda claimed that black soldiers in the American army were second-class citizens and that America was hypocritical in promoting democracy in the world. German radio propaganda emphasized the post-war legacy, the influence of Nazism on United States relations. After the collapse of the regime in 1945, Hitler's dark dream of a German-dominated Europe ended, but the Nazi perception of America continued to have an effect in the post-war period. During World War II, Hitler and his supporters began to see the United States of America as an emerging superpower. Their prediction of a post-war confrontation between the United States of America and the USSR became a reality during the Cold War. The ideological conflict for world domination that Hitler had predicted formed the geopolitical outlines of the second half of the 20th century. The Nazi leaders, especially Hitler, believed that after their overthrow, the United States of America and the Soviet Union would compete against each other. Since the first leaders of the Third Reich, Hitler was deeply concerned about the spread of Bolshevism in the Soviet Union, which he saw as a direct threat to Germany and Western Europe. In the last years of the war, however, he came to the conclusion that America was now also aiming to dominate the world. These views of Hitler showed his perception of America as a combination of industrial giant and military power, and he felt that these two nations with radically different worldviews would have to compete for world domination. This Nazi vision of the future influenced the formation of American policy towards the Soviet Union after World War II. The escalation of the Cold War between 2880, the US and the USSR, accompanied by American support for capitalism and Soviet promotion of communism, reminded leaders of what the Nazis had said during the war. Although Nazi propaganda portrayed the US as inferior, racially corrupt, and effeminate, it also recognized the strength of the American economy and its military power. For this reason, the Nazi authorities suspected that the USA and the USSR would fight for supremacy in Europe and the rest of the world after the Second World War. In the immediate aftermath of the World War, American decision-makers were aware of this strategic threat, the Soviet Union. Some high-ranking Nazi officials who were captured or transferred were among important figures in Hitler's administration, and these officers provided information that influenced the United States' first attempts to contain the Soviet threat. The doctrinal foundations of the Nazi perception of the conflict between the USSR and the US intensified in the context of the emerging Cold War, in which Europe played a crucial role. The Nazi view of the Americans, who saw them as both military and political rivals as well as problematic democracy, also influenced the culture and politics of the Cold War. The Nazis' racist antipathy toward a diverse America contributed to the ideological campaigns that the United States and the USSR waged to legitimize their world power in the nuclear age. Finally, The Nazi conceptions of America played a role in shaping the ideological character of the Cold War and the geopolitical confrontation of the second half of the 20th century. Even though the Nazi regime was wiped out with its ideas, the idea that the USA and the USSR would dominate the world was not far from the truth. The Cold War became a continuation of the struggle for world domination that the Nazi leaders had predicted before. However, the USA became a superpower that steered global processes for decades. The war between Nazi Germany and the United States during World War II was not just a military confrontation, it was a confrontation of opposing values. For the National Socialists, it was obvious that the Aryan race was superior to all other races, that the state and not the citizens was sovereign, and that democracy was an absolute evil. The United States, on the other hand, stood for the ideals of freedom, diversity, and enlightened self-government, despite its shortcomings. They embodied the underlying conflict of ideas that defined the essence of the conflict in the official discourse of war and in the political rhetoric of the warring parties, and was also visible in the First World War. For Adolf Hitler, the National Socialist leadership, and probably most Germans, America was initially regarded as the coarse relative on the other side of the ocean. They despised America as a melting pot, divided by race and ethnicity, and also a democracy. In Mein Kampf and other speeches and writings, Hitler described American society as immoral and incapable of remaining a world power because of the country's racial mixing and democratic system. This perception fitted seamlessly into the overall picture of the National Socialist Party, whose goal was a supposedly pure fascist state led by and for the Aryan race. But as the war progressed, the Nazis began to view America with a mixture of respect and fear. Although they continued to despise the American model of democracy and saw it as impractical, the Nazi leaders, especially Goering, viewed the United States as an industrial and military giant. The production capacity of the United States exceeded that of all Axis powers in terms of tank and aircraft production. This was a major factor in the strategic change in German production towards fighter aircraft. Nazi efforts to create competing examples of Americanization reflected the regime's concern about the growing popularity of all aspects of American culture. This conflict of interest probably reached its peak during the war years, but its consequences were visible far beyond the year 1945. The failure of the Second World War was followed by the Cold War, the ideological conflict between two superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. The belief that the US and the USSR would eventually go into World War was not far from the truth, as the Cold War became the central political issue of the world in the decades that followed. After all, if there was a fundamental problem between Germany and the United States beyond mere military strength, it was the nature of civilization itself. The Nazi regime envisioned a world divided between two races and ruled by a single party, while the United States, although not free of racism itself, advocated political freedom and equality. With the defeat of the Third Reich in the year 1945, European and global society ensured that democratic values triumphed over totalitarianism. But the struggle between different worldviews did not end with the Second World War, but continues to shape modern political reality.